So this week in the Sacred Gathering, we're going to be looking at a story out of the Old Testament. It is the story when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers to show them who he is and begin the process of reconciliation with his family. Now, the size of chunks of text that we take to look at on a Sunday, it can be a little hard to get our heads and our minds around what's going on in this story overall, especially if we're not familiar with it, to get the most out of it. This story is one that I've heard called kind of the first novella. It is a self-contained story at the end of the book of Genesis in which God is kind of culminating a lot of work and transitioning into his chosen people becoming an actual people. So, man, it's hard to tell it briefly if you don't know the story. And if you don't know the story, I would highly recommend reading it. It's very doable. It's only a handful of chapters. It's a very tight, compact story, but a little much for us to tackle all at once on a Sunday. So the story basically goes like this. God is working with a group of very flawed individuals. First we've got Abraham, then his son Isaac, then his son Jacob, also known as Israel. Jacob starts out as someone who's just not following God well at all. He's just kind of a trickster. He's kind of I don't know what the word I'm looking for. I mean, he's basically ripping off people. But he goes over the course of his life from being the person who tricks and steals from others to someone who God is working with and trusts in some way. But over the process of that, he ends up marrying multiple women. He's got concubines. He's got this big, messy family of children, that are coming from 4 different women who surprisingly don't get along very well. So Joseph, when we meet him, has a ton of half-brothers, none of which get along very well. And Jacob, who still has some work he needs to be done by God in his life, has picked a favorite son, and it's Joseph. Joseph starts out as kind of an arrogant young man. He begins to have these visions in which his brothers, in which even his parents are going to bow down to him and give him honor. And being kind of arrogant, being a spoiled favorite child, he decides to tell them about this. So the brothers get mad. They see an opportunity. They sell him into slavery. And then he's sold into slavery in Egypt. He begins to succeed. He won't sleep with the boss's wife, so she accuses him. He goes to jail. He spends a bunch of time in jail. And then there he runs into some royal officials of Pharaoh's court. And then again, we see this ability to kind of know dreams and interpret dreams, as he did earlier in his life. He correctly, with God's help, interprets some of these dreams, and then they go off and continue with their life until Pharaoh has some dreams, these intense dreams that he thinks God or the gods are trying to tell him something, but he doesn't know what to do. So one of the guys he helped earlier, one of the officials from prison, remembers. Joseph is brought before Pharaoh. He interprets the dreams and recognizes that the dreams have to do with a famine. And so he makes some pretty smart suggestions about, hey, if God is warning you that this big famine is coming, maybe we should do some of the preparation. And so he is elevated to a major position in the empire, and he's going about kind of protecting the famine. Meanwhile, his father Jacob and his brothers are starting to go hungry because of this famine, but they hear that there is food because of Joseph's work down in Egypt. So he sends them down. Joseph recognizes his brothers who sold him into slavery. And so he has one full brother named Benjamin. And he recognizes before they were willing to sell me into slavery just because I was being a pain in the butt, right? And so he sets up this very elaborate trap in which it appears that Benjamin has stolen something from him, and he offers them the opportunity. Okay, if you abandon your brother, again, but they don't know that he knows this, right? Because they don't recognize him. He's in disguise. If you're willing to abandon your brother, I'll let you off scot-free. And the other brothers finally say, no, we will not abandon our brother to this. In some ways, we've done this before. We've made this mistake. We're different people now, right? And so at the end of this long story, we get this moment in which Joseph does reveal himself. But it's also very important because in a lot of ways, God has been kind of absent from Joseph's story, and yet Joseph, through reflection, some other things we'll talk about, has noticed what God is up to, and he's going to help us kind of interpret his story overall. So, lot there. If you don't know the story already, that probably wasn't that helpful. You should go read it. But if you do know the story, hopefully a helpful review. And then here is kind of our passage we're going to be looking at this week. Joseph could no longer control himself in front of all his attendants, so he declared, "Everyone leave now." So no one stayed with him when he revealed his identity to his brothers. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians and Pharaoh's household heard him. Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm Joseph. Is my father really still alive?" His brothers couldn't respond because they were terrified before him. Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me," and they moved closer. He said, "I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold to Egypt. Now don't be upset and angry with yourselves that you sold me here. Actually, God sent me before you to save lives. We've already had 2 years of famine in the land, and there are 5 years left without planting or harvesting. God sent me before you to make sure you'd survive and to rescue your lives in this amazing way. You didn't send me here. It was God who made me father to Pharaoh, master of his entire household, and ruler of the whole land of Egypt. Hurry, go back to your father. Tell them this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me master of all Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay. You may live in the land of Goshen, so you'll be near me. Your children, your grandchildren, your flocks, your herds, everyone with you. I'll support you there, so that you, your household, and everyone with you won't starve, since the famine will still last another 5 years. You and my brother Benjamin have seen with your own eyes that I'm speaking with you. Tell my father about my power in Egypt, about everything you've seen. Hurry, bring my father down here." And then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his shoulder. He kissed his brothers and wept, embracing them. And after this, his brothers were finally able to talk to him. Okay, so one of the important things that I think is going on in this story is it is exemplifying a larger biblical theme of kind of these ideas of reversals, right? Of something that looks like it is bad, that God is able to turn into something good. I mean, from their perspective, there's just a bunch of them in this story. Joseph, in their minds, was probably dead, right? Or as good as dead. They thought he was a nameless slave. They'd forgotten about him. And yet, here he is alive and well and in restoration. Speaking of which, this is a story that easily could have turned into a revenge story, right? And yet, Joseph is willing to have reconciliation. He's willing to step back and restore the relationship with his brothers, although they most certainly don't deserve it after what they've done. Revenge would make a lot more sense. We do see comfort in mourning, right? The last time we saw Jacob in this story, he's just desperately sad and unhappy because he has lost his beloved son, and yet there's this comfort, there's this reconciliation that's there. There's also just, don't miss some of the kind of bigger themes which are going to become important in the Bible overall. Joseph starts his story as, yes, a favored son, but he spends most of his adult life as a slave before the situation is reversed and he becomes the ruler of the land. In the same way, they are experiencing a time of famine, and yet God provides a place of provision for them with some pretty wild circumstances to get them there. And so the story is a gospel story in a lot of ways, of God reversing things, of bringing good out of bad, and kind of shocking them. I just think it's important to note in this story that as Joseph was experiencing a lot of hardship in his life, his experience of God working was probably not the one that we prefer, right? Like, we always want it to kind of just be this like kind of slow and steady increase where we're growing in our capacity and our spiritual ability to, listen well to God, and we want to be a little bit more prosperous and smarter and stronger. Like, we just have this idea that things will grow and be good, right? God is providing an amazing change. It's most certainly not the direction we would have chosen, right? Joseph wants this. His life kind of goes and crashes around for a while, and then all of a sudden, God does this amazing thing. I mean, it's not that different of a rhythm than a lot of what Jesus experienced, right? He was basically misunderstood and embraced by all the wrong people, and then killed, except that's what God did to reverse the power of sin and death and darkness, etc. Right? So Joseph experiences this in a lot of ways as well. I think another important thing to note in this story is kind of how Joseph invites us and his siblings back into the story. The beginning of him inviting this new reality that God is doing, right, of making things new, of making things good and beautiful that we would have expected otherwise, begins with his vulnerability. I mean, it's not like they can really probably hurt him this much. He's so big and powerful. And yet, it would be very easy to say, I want nothing to do with these people. I'm not one of you. I'm a sophisticated, powerful Egyptian now. And yet, he begins a step of reconciliation, not by threatening and says, you're going to reconcile with me, right? But saying, I'm not this big, impressive Egyptian. I'm your brother Joseph, right? He lets this kind of persona of who he is. He's claiming in a lot of ways, says, I'm your brother. I'm still Jacob's son. He's reconnecting with his clan, with his roots, with who he is. He's putting aside all the strength. He says, please come near me. And that does imply some vulnerability, right? They could go right back to treating him the way they used to, as the annoying kid brother, of undercutting him. And yet he has said, I'm one of you. I'm with you, even though he is a big, powerful Egyptian now, and it could be easy to kind of go in that direction. I think the other thing I really want to point out in this story is you could hear Joseph say this, and this kind of culmination and understanding of what God is up to is one that people continue to just kind of wrestle with, right? Here's how Joseph describes what has happened. He says, now don't be upset and angry with yourselves that you sold me here. Actually, God sent me before you to save lives. I've already told you the 2 years of famine are coming to the land, and there's 5 more years. God sent me before you to make sure you'd survive, to rescue your lives in this amazing way. You didn't send me here. It was God who sent me here and made me the father to Pharaoh, master of the entire household, and ruler of the whole land of Egypt. So this causation, in some ways, is one that this story wrestles with in some interesting ways. Now, if you're just reading this section, it seems like God is just totally in control. God is, puppet master orchestrating all these things. That's not really the way the story of Joseph is told, right? We are told very explicitly about his brother's motives. Their motives are bad. They are cruel. They are going way and above and beyond what you should be doing to a little brother, especially in this tribal culture. Like, what they did was awful, and their motives for doing so were awful. And nowhere in this story does it say, well, this was actually God's intention. God did this thing because he had bigger plans, right? It's interesting that God is largely absent in this story, aside from these kind of rare moments where he's doing some dream interpreting, or even Joseph, who it turns out his early visions were correct, but man is the path, not the way he would have thought he would have gotten there. And so I as I was reading this week, I saw so much wrestling by theologians with the just meaning of this story, of the fact that God is able to work in and through and in spite of and over and against whatever human intentions, right? And so God is working here and doing something bigger scale and saving people and bringing goodness and restoration out of it. And yet, Joseph is a hard worker. He has to suffer for many years on his own. The brothers' actions against him and the ways he's accused, etc., aren't fair. Those are not necessarily God's will, and he can work in those things. And so there's this interesting kind of balance of God being in control and being good things, and yet not diminishing kind of human effort and human agency, good or bad, in the midst of the story. And so Joseph is I think a fascinating example of the way God can work, the way God kind of collaborates in human history with all of us. And again, I would argue, reading this story, we want to maybe avoid the two extremes of one side or another, of this was all just kind of human planning and a lot of luck and skill made this happen, or that God is orchestrating this whole thing. God is working through it, and it's going to be a major a major turning point and an important story for what God is doing in the world with his reconciliation of the world. But holding those kind of two things in tension is important, because I think Joseph is able to come to this conclusion that God is working in the background at times, is bringing meaning from this thing over a long lifetime of reflection. I seriously doubt, as he's languishing in prison post-slavery, whatever injustices have been done to him, and kind of going, well, I'm just deeply spiritual, and so this must have been God's will the whole way, which is something we still say to each other, usually to others. We don't really say that to ourselves that often. Joseph recognizes the kind of shocking overturning that God has been doing and the shocking opportunities he now has to be reconciled with his brothers, to provide for them, for God to bring something good, that there is enough and abundance and reconciliation where it could not have been, because he's been formed by and he's worked with God in the midst of these really awful circumstances a lot of the time. And so I just think it's a fascinating story. Again, just knowing God's heart. God can work beautiful, good things from nearly any situation. And Joseph is one of those rare people who is able to work alongside God, who's able to reflect and notice what God is doing and be capable of this kind of co-labor of bringing something really important, right? Joseph is the one who's going to make possible the next kind of big stages in what God is doing with humanity. And so I do love this story. I love that Joseph gets to the point he can and is able to humbly recognize that God brought something good at us. He does not need to use his newfound power to distance himself from his family of origin, although that would be tempting for most of us. He doesn't claim that he pulled himself up by his bootstraps right to this position of power. He doesn't take revenge. He is able to see the goodness and the graciousness of what God is bringing about, that this good thing is happening through a life that involved a lot of unjust suffering on his part. So what does it look like for us wherever we find ourselves in that story, with whether we have the perspective looking back of, oh, that's what God might have been up to, or whether we find ourselves in the midst of something that we don't understand the meaning of? Where is God in the midst of this? Do we trust that God can work with all of these situations, and that yet we have some responsibility to be collaborating with God, to be providing some of those things for others, whether it's reconciliation or provision? So I love this story, but there's just so much there. So looking forward to discussing it with you all on Sunday.